I'm Ron Thiemann, and on behalf of the Religion and Society Colloquium and Doctoral Field, I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural lecture in a speaker series entitled Theorizing Race and Ethnicity in Theology and the Study of Religion. We believe that this is a topic that's important for Harvard to consider. It's part of the Religion and Society Doctoral Colloquium, but we're having a series of public events as well to invite people into the consideration of this topic with us. And what we've tried to do is to invite scholars who are really shaping this field, and they tend to be younger scholars, people who are shaping the new thinking and the new understanding of race and ethnicity in a comparative perspective. And so it's an opportunity for us to learn from these visitors, to be exposed to a form of scholarship that's only occasionally present at Harvard, and an opportunity for us to also look at persons who might, in the long run, be part of this community. But moving right along, I don't want to say too much about that, but it is an opportunity, I think, for us to learn new people, to learn new scholarship, and to learn from these visitors. I want to start with some statements of thanks. First of all, to Bill Graham, our dean, who just came in, who provided the funding for the series, along with encouragement from Evelyn Hammond in the Senior Vice Provost office. This series could not have gotten off the ground and will not be able to reach its conclusion without that helpful support from those offices, so we are grateful for that. I also want to thank the three students who have been communicating with many of you, and without whose imagination, commitment, and hard work, this literally could not have happened. Terrence Keel, Mara Willard, and Eleanor Craig have done remarkable work, both in helping us to understand what this lecture series should be like, and then attending to all of the details. So to the three of you, the thanks from all of us. I also want to give special thanks to a graduate of our doctoral program, David Kim, who is sitting here. David's research is also important in the development of the field that we will be looking at. He's become, over the years, a dear friend of mine, and he is serving as the consultant to this project, and I'm sure we could not have moved as quickly to identifying the people we needed to attract to Harvard, nor to begin the conceptualizing of the issues of comparative race and ethnicity if David had not been so helpful to us, as he will continue to be throughout the semester. David teaches at Connecticut College, where he's the inaugural director of the Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity. David Kim is right here in the second row. Thanks, David, for all your help. David is also the author of the recently published Oxford University Press Melancholic Freedom, Agency, and the Spirit of Politics. If we still had a bookstore, I'd tell you you could get it in the bookstore, but trust me, you can get it on Amazon or any other such places. A very interesting work. I've asked Davíd Carrasco, our colleague, to introduce the inaugural speaker in this series. Davíd is, as you know, the Neil L. Rudenstine Professor of the Study of Latin America. Davíd.
Over a year ago, in this very room, there was a colloquium set up by some of the student groups that brought in a series of Latino theologians to talk about the developing field of Latino theological studies. And they asked me to come over and be a part of the event. It was one of those late spring days where we were all working hard and very tired, and I said, well, okay, I'll come over. Since I'm sort of the faculty Latino, I'll come over and be there. And I came in and, was going to throw my support behind the event and the speakers. But about 10 minutes into it, man, I woke up completely because I was so impressed with the quality of the scholarship and critical reflection that was going on at this very table to my left. And I really felt for the first time since I'd been at the Divinity School that some of the efforts of the Divinity School to expand itself, at least within this country, in terms of the new ways in which religion was being theorized, in which people were looking at the development of religious and theological thought, that not only was we getting more serious about it, but we were bringing in some people who were tremendously dynamic, but not only dynamic, well-read, very thoughtful, and really were the kind of people that we should be having here as Ron Thiemann just said, representing forms of scholarship that are only occasionally part of our community. And I think tonight's event is a continuation of that type of very serious introduction to our community of people who are not only well-trained, but have a tremendous imagination and have experience of producing fresh, new work. And so we're very pleased to have here with us for this event, within this new spirit of curiosity and searching within our school, Professor Rudy Busto. Professor Busto comes to us from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And I'd like to read his title to you so you can get a sense of the kind of work and new thinking that he represents. His title is Associate Professor of Asian American / Pacific Islander and Chicana / Latina religions. Let me read that again. Professor of Asian American / Pacific Islander and Chicana / Latina religions. Now that's a series of connections we don't often see, not only here at the university, even on this coast and in many places in the country. He brings this type of focus and complex series of relationships. Following his own education, he received his BA in Religious Studies from Stanford University, where he later taught. He also received a Master of Theological Studies from the Harvard Divinity School. So to borrow a term from the Chicano community, he is, in a way, a homeboy. And he received his PhD in Ethnic Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. In the scope of his work, we see some very familiar types of interest: religion and race in the United States, reflecting what people think he's going to talk about, Chicano / Latino religions. He's very much involved in the study of syncretism and teaching about hybridity and religious change, but as I mentioned, with a real interest in Asian American and Pacific Islander religions. He's also got an interest and teaches in the area of religion and science fiction, as well as First Amendment challenges, in the study of religion and what he calls disheterotopias. Now, Professor Busto's published many essays and works, but his major work is a book called King Tiger, The Religious Vision of Reyes Lopez Tijerina. And y'all got to get down with Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Tijerina was one of the 3 or 4 leading sort of figures during the so-called Chicano movement. Not so the best known. The best known, of course, was Cesar Chavez and then Corky Gonzalez in Denver. But in New Mexico, Reyes Tijerina really captured the country's imagination through some political activity that he was involved in. And also a religious vision that he had and that he expressed. As a matter of fact, they had a huge manhunt throughout New Mexico looking for Reyes Tijerina after he went in and arrested people at the courthouse himself, made a citizen's arrest. And they sent up tanks after him up into the mountains. And as a result of this activity, all involved with land grant materials, he became an inspiration, but a very unstudied person until I wrote a master's thesis on him at the University of Chicago. But it was a nice little master's thesis, but it went nowhere. And as a matter of fact, the study of Tijerina didn't go very far until Professor Busto wrote this wonderful book, King Tiger, The Religious Vision of Reyes Lopez Tijerina, where he argues that Tijerina's religious worldview is at the core of how his life and his political activism. And what Rudy does in this book is he not only gives us a biographical sketch of Tijerina, but Tijerina was a guy who was inspired by Pentecostalism. And what Professor Busto did is he studied the whole history of Pentecostalism along the U.S.-Mexico border and showed how this became part of the New Mexican notion of utopia. And the notion of utopia in Arizona, tied up with the apocalyptic theology of Tijerina. And he did a wonderful close reading of Tijerina's memoir. It's a book we should look at here at the school. His current projects in studying the notion of hybridity in the borderlands is in a project called The Predicaments of Nepantla. The Predicaments of Nepantla. Now, what he does in this work is he takes something that has been a kind of cultural gesture that has been part of the Latino Chicano movement, certainly since 1968-69 when the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán was published. And that's the notion that Latino Chicano identity is tied up in part in looking at and drawing from the symbols and the meanings of indigenous Mexicans, indigenous Mesoamericans, and part of that cosmovision of indigenous people in Mexico and in the Southwest was expressed in a term called Nepantla, which represents this space and time in between. And what Professor Busto has done is taken this notion of Nepantla and brought it into religious studies and brought it into his own cultural studies, but not to just celebrate the notion of Nepantla, which many people do, but to talk about the predicaments of Nepantla. And it's about the exploration of how the theme between things is uncovered in the history and experience of Chicano religion and religious history. What he does here is he does a study of key words. And by doing this notion of key words, it's a kind of new empiricism that has come out of especially his generation of scholars to look at the language and the stories that are told by people who are in the predicament of Nepantla. And finally, he has a new project provisionally entitled Disorienting Subjects, Asian American Religions. And maybe he'll be talking to us about that this evening. So it's a pleasure to introduce him in these his own words. He says, approaching religion in North America through the lens of race and ethnicity allows us to uncover hidden and subjugated histories and actors in American religion. This method also lets us see how the study of religion has itself been structured and shaped by assumptions about race, ethnicity, and the absence of race as a variable for analysis. His talk tonight is entitled Theorizing Race and Ethnicity in Theology and the Study of Religion. Please welcome home Mr. Rudy Busto.
Well, after that introduction, I guess I can go home now, or take David with me wherever I go. Thank you all very much. I want to thank Dean Graham and Ron Thiemann for making this possible, and David for his consultation. My compadre here for his wonderful introduction. Really, thank you so much for that. I want to also acknowledge Professor Kwok Pwilan, who's here this afternoon, and my former student from Santa Barbara, Michael Prain, who I told him I was coming just to check up to make sure he was doing his work here. So thank you all for coming here. Unfortunately, we live in a PC world, and I had offered you a slideshow of my talk, but I'm on a Mac, and the two languages didn't talk, so I preserved the one image that I think is most essential to my talk this afternoon. And so if you will bear with me, we can look at the living Buddha all afternoon as my image here. This talk is part of a larger project that has to do with the way that race structures the experience and history of Asian Americans and Asians in the United States. It comes out of a conversation I had many, many years ago with a Mongolist named Jan Nattier, who at the time was at Indiana University. And in conversation with Jan Nattier, Jan said, there's a community of Mongols living in New Jersey, and nobody knows about them. And I said, Jan, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, there's a real interesting thing that's going on in the historiography about the history of the way that Buddhism comes to the United States. And in the accounts of how Buddhism comes to the United States, one of the interesting absences in those narratives are the Kalmyk Mongols who come from southern Russia. And so that conversation then sort of went to the back of my head and stayed there for a number of years until I was doing some research for another project, and it kept coming across this person, this unknown person called the Diluv Kutakt, or the Diluwa Kutuktu, who is pictured here. And scratching a little bit of the surface, I've realized that here was
a rather substantial figure in American religious history that had absolutely nothing written about him. And so I thought, well, this would be an interesting way to see how and why this particular figure is absent in our narratives. So what I'm going to do for you this afternoon is to read you parts of a paper that have lots of pieces to it. I'm going to skim some parts of it because they're less relevant for today's conversation. And I want to focus in on the legal aspects of how the Kalmyk Mongols in New Jersey almost didn't come to the United States because of the way that the West or the way that the U.S. thinks about issues of race and Asians in particular. I should also say that because when you work in an area for a long time, you forget that other people aren't walking with you on that road. And so David Kim was kind enough to vet the paper for me, and he said, one of the things you assume in this paper is that people understand the difference between race and ethnicity in this. And I thought, that's lecture number 1 in my undergraduate course, and I've completely forgotten it here. And so I just want to say at the outset that when I talk about race in this paper, I'm oftentimes referring to it in the general garden variety sense of the way people understand races to be of a variety of maybe 5 distinct types of human bodies. Although that will be, as you will see in the paper, a problematic notion. I'm not talking about ethnicity so much, which is more of a cultural term. The jury is still out on the exact relationship between religion and ethnicity, and the reasons for that have to do a lot with terminology and language. But for the most part here, I'm going to be using the word race in the garden variety sense, but certainly talking about the problems for the way we do that. Okay, so I will start the paper and then I will stop and digress and we'll see where it goes. I have a clock here, so that will keep me on target. All right. I was telling somebody earlier that I hadn't been in the Braun room this is the Braun Sperry room a number of years, and they said, oh yeah, they shifted the chairs. They used to go like this, and then I was telling them that the first time I came inside the Braun room it was to hear Raimundo Panikar give a talk here. And it was my first year as an MTS student, and Panikar was sitting in the front row, and after he had been introduced, he was wearing this big cape. And he stood up and he flung this cape like this, like a toreador, and I thought, I'm not bringing my cape, just to do that bit. Okay, so looking for the Diluv Kutakt, or the living Buddha. In 1957, the 12th incarnation of the Bodhisattva Tilopa sat for a portrait at the Paul Bishop Studio in Berkeley, California. Well into his 70s, and without English or his companion interpreter, the Mongolian Diluv Kutakt, or living Buddha, sat amiably and patiently for his photographer. Bishop would later remember that the Diluv had, quote, an extremely interesting face, one that is held up beautifully through the years. He continues, the most extraordinary thing about this portrait is how it was done. Usually my tool for getting people to relax and respond to the camera is to talk to them. I just keep talking. But the living Buddha, who was here in Berkeley to help produce a Tibetan English dictionary, didn't speak English. I didn't speak Tibetan, and there was no third party. He arrived for the sitting in his native attire, and he carried a staff, the top of which you can see in his hands. Since there wasn't a translator, we just smiled at each other, and Bishop then took this picture. This genial anecdote reveals several things about the Mongol Diluv, or living Buddha. Besides the magisterial description by Bishop, there's nothing here in this description about the living Buddha's identity as a Mongol. In fact, the caption attached to his portrait as it appears in the University of California's alumni magazine reads, Dilawa Hutuktu, Grand Lama, Living Buddha, Tibet. While we cannot fault Bishop for the error, the Diluv was, after all, Bishop assumed, was in Berkeley to help produce a Tibetan English dictionary. This slip from Mongol to Tibetan is just one example of how the Mongol community in North America has been overshadowed by Tibetan religion and politics. And in fact, the Diluv was in Berkeley to work on a Mongolian English dictionary and not a Tibetan English dictionary, which is something I found out after many, many years and student research assistants looking through Tibetan dictionaries for evidence that he was actually on this project. This project broadens the scope of American religion by incorporating Asian American religious history and its insistence that race plays a central role in the study of religion in the United States. Because we do not as yet have a comprehensive or synthetic treatment of Asian American religious history, this presentation suggests that the long history of Mongolian Buddhists in the United States is emblematic of how Asian Americans have negotiated religion and race. There are two arguments in this presentation already previewed in the Deluve's portrait story. First, the history and reception of Mongols in the United States confirms Michael Omi and Howard Winant's theory of racial formation. That is, that race is culturally and politically contested, destroyed, maintained, and constructed. Second, Mongols in the Western popular scientific and religious imaginary requires the erasure of Mongol American identity, that is, their race, in favor of a palatable and attractive identity promoted by their Buddhist faith, religion. Right? So this talk is about how religion will elide, or a certain kind of religion will in fact elide or erase Mongol identity. There are a number of places we can look and expect to find the Deluve Kutakt in American religion. If we believe the description of him from the New York Times as a great prince of Buddhism and a leading Orientalist scholar, we should expect to learn about him in the voluminous accounts of Buddhism in America. And we can also expect to find him in the scholarly literature on Mongolia and Central Asia. These are, of course, the usual routes for tracking the movements of Buddhism from Asia to the United States. But in fact, these literatures yield surprisingly little, because the rubrics and outcomes of their disciplinary regimes limit their ability to see beyond established narratives and canons of knowledge. The scholarship on Mongolia and Central Asia contains only brief mentions of the Mongol living Buddha before his arrival in the United States in 1949. But this literature is understandably silent on what happens to him after he arrives in the United States. The Buddhism in American sources say nothing about the Deluve Kutakt. Why this is so is considered below. If we cannot find him in these traditional bodies of scholarship, perhaps the Deluve can be found through applying the emergent methods of Asian American religious studies. I can't believe I just said that at Harvard. Okay. That is, in the study of Asian American religion, gaps are revealed when we acknowledge that as racialized and minoritized groups, or as Ron Takaki refers to them as strangers from a different shore, Asian Americans are often hidden or ignored in the narratives of American religion. And although race, ethnicity, and religion are customarily inextricably bound together in community identity, when Asian Americans do appear in accounts of American history and culture, it is race and rarely religion that marks their presence. This is most certainly true in the Mongol-American case. A search for the Deluve Kutakt, the living Buddha, in American religion, however, begins not in outer Mongolia, where you might expect, but in post-World War II Germany, and the effort by Kalmyk Mongols from southern Russia to settle in the United States. In May 2001, the U.S. Congress passed a little-observed resolution congratulating, quote, the Kalmyk people in the United States on the 50th anniversary of their settlement in this country, end quote. Kalmyk Mongols arrived in the United States in 1951 after centuries of movement out of the Mongolian homelands in Central Asia. In the early 1600s, a sizable portion of Oirat, or Western Mongols, had settled in the lower Volga area in southern Russia. Nearly half of these Mongols then returned back to northwestern China in the winter of 1771 at the behest of the Chinese emperor. Now, folklore holds that those groups who had settled on the western side of the Volga River stayed behind because the river was not sufficiently frozen for them to cross over. And so the appellation Kalmyk, some believe, refers to the remainder, or those who could not cross over. Of course, this is folklore. There are other attestations in Turkic languages. And there the Kalmyks remained until catastrophic events in the 20th century would uproot them and send them out into the world. By the 1920s, pockets of Kalmyk Mongols were found scattered throughout the Balkans, Turkey, and Europe, having been swept up in the epic dislocations of the Russian Revolution and the First World War. Between world wars, these small communities clung fiercely to both their ethnic Mongol and Buddhist identities, and later these communities played a critical role in reconstituting Kalmyk religious life, both in the United States and back post-Soviet era when Kalmykia became its own republic. When eventually these Kalmyks came to the United States, they would be referred to as the old immigrants. These are the first wave of early 20th century Kalmyks sent out into diaspora. During World War II, however, Kalmyks who were conscripted for labor when the Nazis retreated from Russia in 1943, while others fled the uncertainty of what might come afterward. In the last days of December of 1943, Stalin dissolved the Kalmyk Autonomous Oblast, the region, and in the freezing winter of 1944, Stalin shipped the entire Kalmyk population in the region to Siberia for their alleged Nazi sympathies. So total was the Soviet attempt to erase the Kalmyks that Russians and Ukrainians were settled in the former Kalmyk region. Kalmyk cities were renamed, and subsequent editions of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia contained no entries for the Kalmyk people or the former Kalmyk Autonomous Oblast. As a consequence, those Kalmyks who had fled Russia in 1943, along with the previous old emigrant Kalmyks, became stateless and classified as displaced persons, or DPs. About half of the 1,500 Kalmyk DPs were clustered in the Ingolstadt and Schleißheim DP camps in Germany after the war, where they came under the jurisdiction of the United Nations and later under the care of the International Refuge Organization, the IRO, the Church World Service, and the Tolstoy Foundation. In 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act to facilitate entry of war victims otherwise unable to emigrate under the nation-based quotas set by earlier federal immigration law. As a result, the United States would resettle almost 500,000 displaced persons within its borders by 1953, and half of these were persons born in Poland and Germany, and 80 of these were Christians. Given the concern by the international community and well-organized agencies working to assist displaced persons, the resettlement of less than 1,000 Kalmyk Mongols should have followed without much fanfare or notice in the face of more than 7 million displaced persons. A list of 17 potential sites as diverse as France, Morocco, Holland, Madagascar, Paraguay, Ceylon, formerly Ceylon, and Alaska, were considered for Kalmyk resettlement, but always without success. Nations of the British Commonwealth and most South American countries refused to allow the Kalmyks entry because they were Asiatic in this old-fashioned term. The Paraguay option, for instance, came to a crashing halt when the newspapers there played out the West's historical fear of Mongols and alarmed readers with the portent that hordes of Mongols were on the horizon. And despite a revision in the immigration law in the United States, the nation of immigrants refused the Kalmyks because they were Mongolians, the older form of the term, and as such were prohibited entry as non-white aliens ineligible for citizenship. By the 6th year of their stay in the DP camps, the Kalmyks had become known in the press as the people for whom there is no room under the sun. In 1950, Saran and Yelena Kitanov, a Kalmyk couple, applied from the Schleißheim DP camps for entry into the U.S. as displaced persons under the 1948 law. Like many other Kalmyks in their diaspora, Saran and Yelena, in fact, I've changed the names here to protect privacy. Saran and Yelena Kitanov had both fled the revolution in the 1920s, both suffering great tragedy in the process, and both ended up in Bulgaria, where they met and married. Later, they moved to Belgrade, where Kalmyk refugees had created a tiny but thriving subculture and had built the first Buddhist monastery in Europe there in 1929. It then appears that the Nazis sent the couple to Germany in 1943, where they worked in a paper factory until 1945. After the war, the couple languished in the Schleißheim DP camp until their immigration case was resolved in 1951. So here you have a Kalmyk couple who's doing everything by the books, taking advantage of the generosity of the United States 1948 law, and what happens is they get caught up in the red tape and the misunderstandings and clumsiness of the INS with regard, and scientists with regard to how to classify these physically Asian people living in Eastern Europe. The Kitanov's application for resettlement and the arguments for and against them offers us an excellent opportunity to see exposed the legacy of European scientific race thinking and the bias against Asians as a race in the United States. In particular, the records of Saran and Yelena Kitanov remind us of how Mongols remain a feared and paradigmatic other in the West. A review of the administrative arguments and decisions by government agencies and advocates for the Kitanovs reveals the inadequacies of scientific speculation about race and the tortured logic required for promoting particular views about Kalmyk racial classification. The Kitanov paper trail begins with the American consulate in Munich. There, United States representatives issued the couple immigration visas in April of 1950 under the quota reserved for Soviet displaced persons. Unfortunately, the U.S. Assistant Commissioner for Immigration in Germany voided the application for immigration because Kalmyks, he said, are not members of the white race. Basing his decision on the 1911 Dictionary of Races and Peoples and conventional sources like the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Assistant Commissioner ruled that as Mongolians, the Kalmyk couple was inadmissible under U.S. immigration laws. Specifically, Saren and Yelena were subject to 3 laws that prohibited Asians from immigrating and or gaining citizenships. First, the Nationality Law or Act of 1940 contained the most recent revision of U.S. policies on immigration and naturalization. Section 303 of the Act preserved the right of citizenship for white persons only that had been placed there by the first U.S. Congress. So the Naturalization Law of 1790 says people who would like to become citizens of the U.S. must be free, in other words, not indentured servants. They must be free, and they must live in the United States for 2 years, and they must be white. So the 1940 law then carries us through, but it had included the African Americans, their descendants, and Native Americans, which had been added in 1924. Antecedent to the 1940 Nationality Act, however, the possibility of Asians entering into the country, let alone become citizens, had been forbidden under the Immigration Act of 1924, commonly known as the Oriental Exclusion Act. This law stipulated that, quote, no alien ineligible to citizenship shall be admitted to the United States. Beginning with the exclusion of certain categories of Chinese laborers in 1875 and Chinese citizenship as early as 1878, later refinements to exclusionary immigration laws kept pace with changing circumstances and repeated attempts by Asians to come to the United States and become fully vested American citizens. Although exclusionary immigration laws were not aimed directly at the Kalmyk DPs, they reveal the ongoing efforts by the United States government to prevent the entry and citizenship of Asians. The 1924 prohibition against aliens ineligible to citizenship put Asians in a double bind, because even if they were allowed in the United States or had spent most of their lives here, they were disqualified for citizenship based upon their membership in a prescribed racial group, right? So aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? Even if you're here, sorry, the naturalization laws prohibit you from gaining citizenship. 2 naturalization cases involving Asian immigrants had reached the Supreme Court successively 2 years prior, preparing the way for the 1924 exclusion of Asians. In one of these cases, Bhagat Singh Thind, a Punjabi, a Sikh petitioner, had argued that scientific classification of Indians, South Asians, as Aryans qualified him for naturalization as a white person. Right? So using this old linguistic term. The Supreme Court, however, was unconvinced. Right, so the district court, the Ninth District Court had allowed Thind to become a citizen because they bought his argument. Right, Thind's lawyers argued that in fact if you trace the linguistic families, right, from India, the Punjab in particular, a lot was made of the fact that the Punjab is northwest India, so not really India, sort of northwest India, closer to Europe, right? The court would have none of this. Right? They were unconvinced. And this is the famous quote from that court case. Quote, while it may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, the court admitted, nevertheless, the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. End quote. In other words, any person on the street looking at Bhagat Thind could tell he was not white. And here, what's amazing is that common sense, not science, was sufficient proof for the Supreme Court of the United States. U.S. versus Thind thus smoothed the way for the double whammy of the 1924 Oriental Exclusion Act. As aliens ineligible to citizenship, the Kitanovs were clearly ineligible for immigration. The third legislative act invoked in the administrative argument against the Kitanovs was the so-called Barred Zone Act of 1917. Designed primarily to keep South Asians from immigrating, The government made the most of the opportunity, and barred the immigration of anyone coming from an imaginary triangle covering most of Asia and stopping just short of the Kalmyk homelands. The borders of prohibition ran east of an imaginary line from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, Aegean and Black Seas, through the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian Sea, along the Ural River, and then through the Ural Mountains. Technically, the Kalmyk Mongols were exempt from this map of exclusion by virtue of their southern Russian provenance. The barred zones border looped around them to the south and even touched the eastern border of their territory as it edged the Caspian Sea. So the 1917 law didn't really cover their territory. Nonetheless, the Kalmyks' Asiatic appearance was too much of an argument to include them in the eligible category. So what you have here is a very interesting situation where you have everything about their geographic location arguing for their admittance, but the physical appearance of them working completely against them. Advocates for the Khitanovs appealed to the INS, arguing against a biological race test in light of geography and the Kalmyks' cultural proximity to Europeans. They noted that, quote, the Kalmyk ethnic group has been identified with European people by several generations of affinity, education, cultural activity, and 33 years of Soviet rule in Russia, resulting in their membership in the white race. Right? The documents are actually quite somber in this language, and you just have to giggle when you read this because it makes for entertainment. In response, the Board of Immigration Appeals was convened in February of 1951 to review the matter. Weighing the arguments, the board sided with the Khitanovs and reversed the commissioner's denial. He had denied their immigration. To the list of cultural arguments for Kalmyk whiteness, the board added that 300 years of having lived in southeastern European Russia meant the Kalmyks had left their semi-nomadic habits as Mongols, right? Meaning that, like Europeans, they had settled on land and carried on their occupation of herding on collective farms. Never mind that they had been forced to do so under Soviet policies of collectivization. The board asserted that despite their Asiatic origins, the Kalmyks were partially integrated with other Russian ethnic groups. In addition, Saran and Yelena Khitanov spoke Russian and knew very little of the Kalmyk language. So here you have the board saying, oh, okay, so they're really Europeans. Right? The board also made reference to precedent immigration cases dealing with what I call the fuzzier borders of Asian identity, namely Arabs, Armenians, Afghans, Syrians, and especially the case regarding a Tartar Muslim from Russia. The latter case, the Shemyov case, decided a year prior, involved the 32-year-old man who had served in the Soviet army during World War II, had been captured by the Nazis, and eventually ended up with the Khitanovs in the DP camps. The INS, however, had refused his application for resettlement because science held that Tartars were in fact members of the Mongolian race, and that the general racial ineligibility of Mongolians and other Asiatics rendered him ineligible for naturalization. On appeal, Shemyev was permitted entry into the United States. The Board of Immigration Appeals argued against blood in favor of cultural evidence that, in fact, the Tartar group, quote, the Tartar group have become absorbed in the mass of Eastern European peoples and more or less Europeanized in blood and custom, even though racial traces are still discernible. Right? So here, the INS is waffling because they're saying, well, we can still see that he looks slightly Asian, but culturally he seems to be Europeanized. In addition, quote, the test of eligibility for naturalization under the Nationality Act of 1940 as a white person, it noted, quote, it is not the origin of the applicant's racial strain, right, that he's Mongolian in race, but rather the racial composition evaluated at the present time. Now, I'm not sure what that means, that they would say it's not about what race you are coming out of scientifically, but how we evaluate it at the present time. Right. So science is kind of out the window at this point. In other words, Shemyev's eligibility was not based upon biological genealogy, but the cumulative effects of history, culture, and religion as mitigating factors. Yet, as if unconvinced by its own arguments, the official report of the Shemyev proceedings includes an appendix, a beautiful chart on the racial origins of the Tartars, schematizing in a bizarre Linnaean tree fashion the branches and subgroups of the Mongolian race. As members of the Sibiric branch of the Mongolian family, called Ural-Altaic linguistically and Mongoli-Tartaric in an ethnical sense. Tartars formed their own subgroup in the narrow sense that they lived mostly in southeastern Russia and could claim monotheistic religion. Right. Visually, the chart distanced the Tartaric subgroup from the Mongolian subgroup by inserting 4 other subgroups between them. Right. So there's a way in which the Tartar folks are arguing that they may be from the Mongolian family, from the Siberic branch, but unlike the Kalmyks, there are Finns and Turks and Uzbeks and Japs, and which is the language of the chart, and people from the Arctic between them. Right. Following closely the logic and precedent in the Tartar case that culture was a better measure of race than biology, the Board of Immigration Appeals ruled that the Kitanovs' appeal for admission be sustained. A month later, the Central Office of the INS balked at the board's decision and refused to accept the Tartar arguments for the Kalmyks, insisting on the distinction that, quote, the Tartars are members of the Tartaric group, whereas the Kalmyks are members of the Mongolian group. The Kalmyks are more closely related to language to the Mongols of northern China rather than to the Tartars. The Kalmyks are more Asiatic than the Tartars in appearance and culture, and the settlement of the Kalmyks in European Russia was insufficient in recent time for them, such that they still retained much of their original speech and culture. The Kitanov case was then sent back to the Board of Immigration Appeals for further consideration and clarification. And so the case goes back and forth several times. It is clear, however, that the Central Office was hoping for an exclusion decision. Keep them out. To bolster their petition, the Central Office had even gone as far as taking photographs of Saran and Yelena to demonstrate their contention that, quote, the Kalmyks are more Oriental than European. Look at them, you can see them. They are, in fact, Asian. Now reconvened, the board reiterated their arguments for the Europeanization of the Kalmyks, again relying on the precedent Tartar case, but now supplementing their case with 14 additional reference sources. You imagine their clerks running to the library to dig up anything they could find in the law libraries. To their credit, the board rejected the common sense view of whiteness that had been the basis for Asian exclusionary laws, such as the Supreme Court case and the Thin case. They claim that the 1940 Nationality Act did not test eligibility for naturalization according to whether a person looks like a white person. Quote the INS Board of Immigration Appeals. The Kalmyks of southeastern European Russia are admittedly of Mongolian origin, as are the Tartars of the same general area, but these parallel racial groups have both become fused with the rest of the racial minorities of southeastern Russia by a gradual process of association and marriage. Thus, both the Kalmyks and Tartars have become, quoting the Tartar case, more or less Europeanized in blood and custom, even though the racial traces are still discernible. Okay, in the end, the Board of Immigration Appeals affirmed their support for Saran and Yelena Kitanov, but it deferred any final decision to the U.S. Attorney General's office. In other words, the INS goes back and forth, but doesn't want to create the case for this one group of Asian-looking people, and they say, well, we'll give it to the Attorney General, who is in a temporary position anyway. He's only acting, so we will let him deal with this. But on July 28, 1951, J. Howard McGrath, the acting Attorney General of the United States, agreed with the board and approved the Kitanovs for immigration to the United States. On that day, Kalmyk Mongols became Europeans, and therefore white persons, and eligible for immigration and citizenship. But why were Mongolians or Mongols specifically proscribed as a category? The term Mongolian, of course, or Mongol, has a long history in the West associated with fierce horseback riding nomads, pillaging hordes, and unspeakable acts of cruelty. The incomprehensible vastness of the Central Asian plains was inexplicably empty of civilization to the West, and always baffled the West. It is in this space, quote, to the furthest land claimed in Asia by the Muscovite that belong to the dark races of men, wrote British Dr. Robert Knox in 1950. And, quote, of these races, the Mongol was once the most powerful. His reign was that of terror and desolation for the rest of mankind. Lots of examples in literature of this use of the image of Mongols as the absolute threatening other. Imagining and inventing Mongols as others reaches as far back into the roots of the Western tradition. weaving ethnographic reports of strange races beginning in late antiquity with a biblical cosmology. U.S. case law on immigration and naturalization into the 20th century applied the term Mongolian as a shorthand encompassing a whole range of East, Southeast, and Central Asian groups. Derived from the scientific taxonomy of humans, the term Mongolian and the related genetic disorder Mongoloidism is still firmly lodged in legal discourse, the biological sciences, and popular culture. As the most Western of the Mongol groups and living at the edge of Europe, the Kalmyks occupy a long and specific place in the visualization, racialization, and anthropometric description of Asian others. In fact, the Western scientific pejorative use of the terms Mongolian and Mongoloid originates in physical data collected about Kalmyk Mongols. For instance, the INS photographs of the Kitanovs continues a very long tradition of Kalmyk physical description in the service of scientific classification. Beginning in the 18th century, these representations and measurements of Kalmyk bodies by Europeans culminated in the work of the Dutch phrenologist Petrus Camper. Camper's speculation on a single Kalmyk skull to demonstrate racial hierarchies and deficiencies across human groups would influence later and better-known race theorists, including de Gobineau, Buffon, and Johannes Blumenbach. Camper would write, "It is amusing to contemplate an arrangement of these skulls, placed in a regular succession. Apes, orangs, Negroes, the skull of the Hottentot, Madagascar, Celebes, Chinese, Moguler, Kalmuk, and diverse Europeans. It was in this manner that I arranged them upon my shelf in my cabinet." Into the 20th century, the physiometric qualities of Kalmyks find expression in Paula Rubel's curious overview of Kalmyk morphology and seriology in her research on community life. So Paula Rubel writes this whole book on the reconstitution of the Kalmyk Mongol community in the U.S., and she can't resist the scientific history of Kalmyks as scientific objects. So she has this whole thing about their blood quantum. Scientific graphs the whole bit. Similarly, Carlton S. Kuhn, controversial Harvard anthropologist, whose career focused on racial taxonomy and their implied hierarchies, published a series of race-type photographs of Kalmyk immigrants in the University of Pennsylvania Museum Bulletin. Ironically, 18th century scientific speculations about what a single Kalmyk skull revealed by Camper lingered on to inform the INS about living Kalmyks in the 20th century. It was Johannes Blumenbach, however, who would give us the now common sense view that there are 5 races, and the use of the term Mongolian as an umbrella term for Asians. So foundational is Blumenbach's formulation of 5 races that appealed to his work by the U.S. federal court in 1878 dictated anti-Asian immigration policy for the next century. That year, 1878, Ah Yup, a native and citizen of the Empire of China, the documents say, and of the Mongolian race, tested the limits of naturalization law by becoming the first Asian to petition for U.S. citizenship. Such a naturalization was limited at the time to aliens being free white persons and to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. The question of Ah Yup's eligibility rested upon the question, is a person of the Mongolian race a white person within the meaning of the statute? Briefly stated, the court ruled against Ah Yup by surveying the available scientific classifications, beginning with Blumenbach, that concluded the Mongolian or yellow race is clearly separate from the Caucasian or white race. Since Ah Yup's deployment of scientific racial classification against Asians as Mongolians became standard practice for anti-Asian exclusion legislation, this would happen in case after case after case, even though real Mongolians or Mongols would not arrive in the United States for almost another 3/4 of a century. So the fact that we get in 1878 the word Mongolian as a scientific classification in the literature, we don't actually see a real Mongol until 1951. Or 49, actually. The process, rhetoric, and legal background around the Kalmyk Mongol resettlement in the United States lets us observe how race is socially and politically contested, destroyed, maintained, and constructed. Omi and Wynant call the mechanisms for such processes racial projects. where, quote, human bodies and social structures are represented and organized, end quote. Such projects are racial projects, and these are institutions, bodies of knowledge, of varieties of discourse, collective actions, and so forth. These projects reveal how, quote, race is a matter of both social structure and cultural representation, as I have argued here in this paper. Racial projects, Omi and Wynant explain, do the ideological work of linking social structures and cultural representations, quote Omi and Wynant. A racial project is simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial dynamics, and an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. And here, in this case, citizenship or naturalization is the resource that's being redistributed along racial lines. Racial projects connect what race means in a particular discursive practice and the ways in which both social structure and everyday experiences are racially organized based upon that meaning. What Omi and Wynant are referring to is, of course, is the idea that concepts of race, not the biological meaning of race, but concepts of race and how they are negotiated in culture and in politics and in popular culture, that these become not simply the epiphenomenal secondary effects of institutions, representations, legislation, but they are in fact driving. They structure civil society. It's a strong argument they make in their book, Racial Formation in the United States. But you can see it in the Kitanov case that certainly these notions of what race is based upon some scientific notion that you can actually come to some agreement about what a race is by pouring sand in an empty skull and measuring volume. Falling back on these kind of reductionist and positivistic modes of science, that there's something amiss in the way that science grabs onto notions of race as if though to put a stamp of authenticity and truth on it. Having the INS and the U.S. Attorney General change the race of an entire people by fiat is precisely the type of racial formation project that underscores the shifting nature and meaning of race as a concept. Omi and Wynant's theory of racialization demonstrates how bodies of discourse, science, religion, common sense, political will, popular imagination, etc., operate sometimes in tandem or collide around matters of race and the potential outcomes of race differences. Thus, their claim that racial projects involve the recognition and redistribution of resources along particular lines, or particular racial lines, has clear meaning in the Kalmyk immigration experience, where resources translates into the rights and privileges of immigration and naturalization. As we have seen, the government documents or structures reveal the slipperiness in the overlap, collusion, and reinterpretation of different kinds of discourse, cultural representations. Okay, let me move now to conclusion about the living Buddha. So all that to say that one side of the story is this Kalmyk issue with the legislation around racial classification. The other issue has to do with how religion then serves to erase Mongol identity in favor of Tibetan religion. Prior to the Kalmyk resettlement, there was, of course, already a prestigious Mongol religious leader living in the United States. The reincarnated bodhisattva represented both political and spiritual power, a rank just below Tibet's Dalai and Panchen lamas, and the Javzan Damba Kuktakt, who was a civil and religious head of Mongolia. The son of poor shepherds, the child demonstrated amazing abilities, including, as you would expect, recognizing a bowl that he had owned in a previous incarnation. He was officially named at the age of 5 as a reincarnation of the previous Deluve, who had died the same year the future Deluve was born. He left his family and began formal religious training and preparation at the Narobanchen Monastery as the 9th Mongol Deluve Kuktakt. At age 11, he was translating Tibetan text into Mongolian, which is probably not an easy thing to do. And at 18, he was installed as the co-head with the Narobanchen Lama, his disciple in a previous incarnation, co-head of the Narobanchen Monastery. Endowed with great personal charisma, the Deluve Kuktakt becomes a revered spiritual figure in Central Asia. As a governor of one of Mongolia's 4 provinces from 1912 to 1921, the Deluve could not avoid the political upheaval that engulfed Mongolia, haplessly located between the Soviet Union on the one hand and increasingly in volatile China on the other, and the designs of the Japanese Empire. When the Mongolian People's Republic took control in 1924, the Daluv resigned his civil office, but retained his prestige among his people as a religious figure. In 1931, he endured a long and humiliating inquisition by Mongolian People's Republic apparatchiks in a people's court regarding his alleged involvement with Japanese sympathizers. A few days later, seeing the writing on the wall, the living Buddha fled outer Mongolia, escaping certain execution in the savage destruction of Buddhism in his homeland over the next few years. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Buddhist lamas were murdered in Mongolia. Slipping into Inner Mongolia in a small caravan and accompanied by his disciple, the Daluv attempted to build a life there. When the Japanese invaded and occupied Inner Mongolia, he fled once again, this time to Chungking, where his rank and erudition caught the attention of the nationalist Chinese government, who appointed him as an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek on Mongol-Tibetan issues. In the context of civil unrest in China and the systematic destruction of Buddhism in Mongolia, the exiled living Buddha found his way to India, Japan, and Tibet. In Lhasa, Tibet, he became a trusted advisor to the family and entourage of the current Dalai Lama. In 1931, the Daluv met Owen Lattimore, the scholar of Central Asia, later accused of being a communist spy. They became fast friends, and Lattimore made every effort to see the living Buddha whenever he was in Asia. Their association proved mutually beneficial to their careers and spheres of influence. The Daluv's extensive knowledge and experience informed Lattimore's controversial public and scholarly defense of Mongolian political autonomy over the next 2 decades. Lattimore's connection to the U.S. State Department literally saved the Daluv's life when he arranged for the living Buddha's escape from Asia. Late in 1948, the living Buddha could foresee the communist victory in China and wrote to Lattimore that he would leave Tibet for India, a safer venue for him. Early in 1949, he was in Nanking advocating on behalf of his Tibetan patrons when Owen Lattimore suggested he find refuge in the U.S. As it happened, the living Buddha was godfather to Lattimore's son David, who David would later become Classics Professor at Brown University. So David Lattimore is the godson of the living Buddha. So asking the living Buddha to come to the United States to see his godson served as a convenient excuse for the Katok to leave Asia. On February 28, 1949, the living Buddha, dressed in a brown silk robe, descended from an airplane in Washington, D.C., where he was greeted by a U.S. State Department official and his good friend, Owen Lattimore. And so the Daluv and Lattimore become a well-known pair in certain circles, and lots of pictures of the Daluv with Lattimore attending to official functions. When he was not engaged in scholarly work at Lattimore's Mongol Studies project at Johns Hopkins, the living Buddha could be seen wandering the campus. He frequently traveled to North Haven to visit David Lattimore, spent hours in Yale's Sterling Library, where the only complete set, supposedly, of the Buddhist canon outside Asia was housed. Throughout the 1950s, he could be found in Berkeley working on linguistic projects, so on and so forth. And when the Kalmyks arrived in New Jersey in the early 50s, the living Buddha moved to New Jersey to live among them as their resident priest. What's interesting is that the living Buddha from Mongolia was a Halkha Mongol, who spoke a dialect that was completely unintelligible to the Kalmyk Mongols. But because the Kalmyk Mongols, the old immigrants, spoke Croatian, or they spoke French, or they spoke Turkish, or they spoke Kalmyk. It was interesting that you have this mutually unintelligible communication problem. Yet the living Buddha finds that he is happiest among his co-ethnic or co-Buddhist ethnic folks. So there he lives until 1955, when a Kalmyk priest, another Kalmyk priest, arrives in the community with advanced training. This priest, Geshe Wangyal, had been appointed by the Dalai Lama to, in fact, work with the Kalmyk community. Unlike the living Buddha, who was very much involved in the religious lives of the community, the new priest, Geshe Wangyal, consciously made little, if any, effort to integrate his works with the needs of the Kalmyks. Wangyal shared a common ethnic affinity with the Kalmyks living in New Jersey, but he distanced himself from them. According to one scholar, allegedly and judging by his hostility towards those Kalmyks, he left under a cloud of unfriendliness towards its higher priests who were also academics, right? So Geshe Wangyal saw it as his mission to establish an academic or philosophical Buddhism, unfamiliar to most of the Kalmyks who were community people living out their Buddhism within their community. It took Wangyal several years to build support for his vision of Buddhism among a small segment of the Kalmyks, though most of his funding and assistance came from interested white supporters attracted to the doctrines and philosophies of Tibetan Buddhism. Eventually, Wangyal, the other priest, was able to build the Lamaist Buddhist Monastery of America in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in 1958, now known as Labsham Shedrom Ling, the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center. Although his reluctance to engage the emigre Kalmyks could be seen as callousness or even scholarly hubris, his goals and accomplishments were merely the continuation of an impulse for religious renewal and deepening among the Kalmyks begun in the 19th century, but forestalled by 20th century world events. Now revived as a viable project in the United States, Geshe Wangyal's promotion of academic Tibetan Buddhism quickly attracted European American students, most famously Robert Thurman, who's now at Columbia, and Jeffrey Hopkins at the University of Virginia, leading Western interpreters and promulgators of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. So what you have is an interesting situation where in the Kalmyk community you have two reigning doctors of theology, right? One of them, the living Buddha, who is content to stay in the community. Geshe Wangyal, who has a mission to spread the Tibetan Dharma in the United States. This split in religious leadership leads to the invisibility of the Kalmyk Mongol community in the narratives of American religious history, and I'm almost coming to the end here. As Wangyal's success and visibility grew beyond the Kalmyk community, it was only natural that scholars and seekers would gravitate towards his presentation of Tibetan Buddhism. That Wangyal could speak English certainly accounts for much of his success. So explains the partial history of the Tibetan tradition's transmission to the U.S. as described in the scholarly literature. Much of this skewed history has to do with the way the Dilub Katak, the living Buddha, and Geshe Wangyal understood and pursued their practice of the Dharma. Content to follow the ritual cycle with the Kalmyk community, the living Buddha found no reason to evangelize for his religion. He gathered no disciples in the United States, and so there was no lineage to perpetuate. Lattimore makes this observation that the living Buddha did not regard himself as a missionary of his religion. Quote, his attitude towards those who had a serious vocation for Buddhism, was interesting. He said to me, Lattimore, once, that such people could not expect enlightenment in this life. According to the degree of their striving, they would, in their next rebirth, be a little nearer to understanding. Such an inquirer would, after a number of births, could be born at last a Tibetan or a Mongol. And then, and only then, would he be ready to become a true Buddhist. On another occasion, when he was asked about Buddhist demons and ghosts, his lack of missionary zeal was apparent. Quote, such a lecture is of no use to people who do not believe in the Buddha and who laugh when they hear about ghosts. Content to live with religious pluralism, the living Buddha told the New York Times reporter, quote, that all differences between East and West would disappear if people would faithfully practice their religions, regardless of what they may be, end quote. From his perspective, Buddhism was indistinguishable from ethnic identity or racial identity, and so his suspicion about religious seekers. Unlike Wangyal, who imagined the renewal and transmission of academic Tibetan Buddhism from Asia to the United States, the living Buddha had no need to alter the world and its religions from what already was. The difference between the Dilub and the more famous Wangyal is the preference by the Dilub for maintaining Mongol identity in his Buddhist practice, while the latter was motivated by a universal view of a universal view of the Tibetan tradition and its active progress in the world. In intent and effect, Wangyal's mission was, according to Edelman, who interviewed him, quote, an attempt to rescue the religion of the Kalmyks from degeneracy by introducing from Tibet a special kind of religious organization, a monastic university, an organization that the Kalmyks had not previously possessed. It was not a doctrinal innovation or a new sect, but an effort to re-Tibetanize Kalmyk Buddhism, end quote. And it is this difference between the Dilub Katak and Geshe Wangyal that helps explain how Mongolian ethnic identity became subsumed under Tibetan religion. Despite the close historical and religious links between Mongols and Tibetans, the contemporary way these groups are viewed in the West could hardly be more opposite. Kevin Stewart's study of how Mongols reside in Western consciousness reveals that the way Americans react to them can be measured in the reception of the Dalai Lama as the tranquil spiritual leader. And if you've watched the papers last week, you've seen him shaking hands with President Bush. Crowds, adoring crowds on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cruel and violent reputation of Genghis Khan. Right? As geography, Mongolia is absent in the popular religious imagination of the West romance with Buddhism, while Tibet, Shangri-La, enjoys broad political support and patronage among many whose view is colored by popular representations of Tibetan culture, religion, and the ubiquitous Dalai Lama. The reconstruction of Tibet as a sacred landscape filled with peaceful Buddhist laymen, priests, and exotic ancient religious practices are artifacts collected out of the West imaginative archaeology and invention of Tibet. We see the echo of this preference for Tibet in the caption to the 1957 portrait of the Mongol Deluve, Grand Lama, Living Buddha, Tibet. Other evidence for how completely Mongol ethnicity or race has been elided and replaced by Tibetan religion is the invisibility of the Deluve in the popular and scholarly literature on the origins of Tibetan Buddhism in the United States. To make this point, both recent and well-known scholarly overviews of Tibetan Buddhism in America name Geshe Wangyal as the earliest religious leader of the Tibetan Gelug tradition, or simply omit the Mongol contribution entirely. In fact, to the Deluve Kutak should go the honor of being the first religious leader of the Gelug tradition in the United States, preceding Geshe Wangyal by almost a full decade. It is nevertheless clear why scholars have given Wangyal that honor. Unlike the Deluve, whose presence among the Kalmyks passed unnoticed by scholars of American religion and seekers of Buddhism, Wangyal's mission falls within both of Jan Natier's categories of export and import transmission of Buddhism to the West. Export because Wangyal consciously attracted European American interest, and import in its appeal to educated, moneyed, and leisured seekers. Unfortunately, coming to the end here, the complete silence about the Deluve has also meant the absence of a community of Kalmyk Mongol Buddhists in the scholarly literature. Caught chronologically between the historian's search for the earliest Buddhist communities in North America and the sociologist's fieldwork among post-1965 new immigrant Asian Buddhists, our lack of understanding or basic knowledge about Kalmyk Mongols in America is regrettable. Such a loud silence, nevertheless, speaks to the Western Orientalist preference for the spiritual and associated political ideals represented by Tibet's struggle for autonomy and Tibetan Buddhism. The Living Buddha and Geshe Wangyal were both Mongols and Buddhists of the highest rank, but the way they chose to live out and represented Buddhism emphasized primarily Mongol ethnic identity or racial identity on the one hand, or Tibetan religious identity. As Buddhists, Mongols have not been given enough credit in contemporary scholarship for the preservation and transmission of the Dharma in the United States. One specialist in Mongol and Tibetan Buddhist texts has complained that, in fact, quote, the Western academic world pays far less attention to Mongolian Buddhism in general than to its Tibetan ancestor. That those who take an interest, whether personal, academic, or both, in Tibetan Buddhism know of Mongolian Buddhism as a curious copy or later type of Tibetan Buddhism. The replacement of the term Lamaism, which is the old term for the tradition, Lamaism, which usefully embraced the Buddhism of both nations, is now replaced by the parochial phrase Tibetan Buddhism, and this is sufficient proof of this preference for Tibetans over Mongolians. In the U.S., the fetishization of Tibet and the general climate of sympathy towards particular presentations of Buddhism over others has meant the disappearance of Mongol racial identity in favor of Tibetan Buddhism. The discourse and politics around Tibetans in diaspora, in the sense of exile, have overcome the historicity of displaced Mongols in diaspora, in the sense of scattering. The desire by many Americans for Buddhism that is tailored to textual traditions, personal transformation, convenience, and certain forms of meditative practice and therapeutic Oriental monks works against a more comprehensive understanding of Buddhist traditions and histories as they occur in Asian American communities. All that means is that the popular forms of Buddhism among the American public are those that are aimed towards the individual, personal psychological transformation, and a product line. While those traditions of Buddhism which primarily reside in ethnic communities, say Japanese American or Chinese American communities, that these are uninteresting to seekers because they are exactly that, their community traditions. Finally, let me just say that looking for the Davíd talk reminds us that there are always other stories to be told in the narrative of religion in the United States. In the stories about how the swans came to the lake, we must remember that such accounts are themselves racial projects. By actively selecting and replicating particular versions of Buddhism's transplantation in North America, these histories enact racial dynamics that we can uncover under close scrutiny. In addition, we must continually bracket the hagiographic impulse in telling these stories if our goal is truly to reveal as much about this history as possible. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and Rudy, why don't you acknowledge people and respond, and we'll go from there. So please, questions from the floor.
Crystal clear. Yes?
Well, I just kind of get some facts straight. So, Geshe Wangyal is a Tibetan.
He's Kalmyk Mongol.
Pardon?
He's a Kalmyk Mongol. Wangyal is a Kalmyk Mongol, but he was trained in Tibet. Mm-hmm. And appointed by the Dalai Lama. So he actually has a closer affinity to the community than the living Buddha, who's a Khalkha Mongol from Mongolia. If you are chosen and particularly gifted, you can be sent to Tibet for your PhD, much like coming to Harvard Divinity School for your higher degree. Right? It's a place for the refining of your abilities in the disputation process, actually, in the tradition.
So Mongolia was kind of oriented toward Tibet as far as scholarship?
Yeah, there's a long history that I've left out here for purposes of time, but the connection between Mongolia and Tibet go back into at least into the 12th century. In fact, the word Dalai in Dalai Lama, Dalai is a Mongol term. It means ocean. In the 16th century, what's called the second conversion of the Mongols happens, conversion to Tibetan Buddhism, and there's always this back and forth between Mongols and Tibetans. Mongols are oftentimes the protectors of the tradition because they're fierce, right? So as Buddhists, they see the Kalmyk Mongols, they see the Dalai Lama as their spiritual head. But there the question is it religion or is it ethnicity or race at that point, right? So as it turns out, one can understand why, in fact, we hear the phrase Tibetan Buddhism, and you never hear the term Mongolian Buddhism unless you're at an academic conference and there are Mongolists present. Otherwise, it's always Tibetan Buddhism, right? Sometimes it's Vajrayana, but then that makes other people unhappy. So, yeah.
Can I ask another just factual question?
Sure.
So what was the historical progression of Buddhism getting to Tibet and Mongolia? Was that on the way to China?
Actually, Buddhism goes to Tibet first before it goes to China. I think I'm right. I'm not a tantra expert, but there is certainly a branch that goes into the Himalayas. I'll put it that way. It goes to Tibet first, and then goes to Mongolia. Yes.
So, Rudy, one of the questions I had at the end of the paper, or this prevailing theme that you had across the paper, was the ways in which certain structural understandings about race, ethnicity, religion overdetermine attempts at cultural survival. Just to simplify, what you were saying, right? So part of the question I had was, if part of what's going on here is this kind of losing wager, that cultural survival will it's always struggling against these larger structural things. And this is Omi and Winans' point, right? That the structures are always going to overdetermine. And so, what happens now? You say, well, look, we should be paying attention at minimum to Mongolian Buddhists as much as we have to this genealogy of Tibetan Buddhists, right? And yet, that those communities have been ascribed another identity, right?
Yeah, so we don't talk about Mongols, we talk about Tibetans. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean I would amend your statement a little bit about being overdetermined, because it's always in flux, right? It's always so the talk today, right, gets into the minds of the students, right, and professors, and they begin to talk about how there's another form of, or another way that we can talk about Tibetan Buddhism, right, as sort of the Mongolian version. I mean, the problem with the issue about Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhism is that Mongolian Buddhism still retains a lot of the quote unquote shamanistic elements in it, whereas the standard line is the Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan version hasn't, which actually isn't necessarily true. There are also shamanistic elements in the Tibetan tradition. But your question is more about the wager. Is that really your question?
Yeah, I mean, if you're, I mean, you had this backdrop of Cold War disputations about what ethnic groups and what ethnic groups are recognized and which ones are not, right? And the ones that aren't fall within. Between the cracks of these large, and this is what I mean by overdetermination.
I see what you're saying. Okay, right. So in the larger geopolitical struggle, right? One of the reasons that Tibet gets all the press is because Lattimore is thought to have been the person who lost China, right? So there's this grieving over the fact that the West, that we've lost China to the communists, and of course Tibet becomes part of that loss, right? Whereas Mongolia, which adopts a Soviet-style state, is associated with the evil Soviet Union, right? So Mongolia, so the geopolitics also then color the way that is part of the reason why we prefer Tibet over Mongolia, right? Although that's changing now, because George Bush spent 4 hours on the tarmac in Mongolia, so we could shake hands with the costumed guy. I saw a car commercial about a year ago where in usual fashion, the cars racing through the Utah Salt Flats, and there are banners that mark the line of the car, and the banners are inscribed with the old Mongol script. And I almost fell out of my couch chair when I saw that. So Mongolia, may be coming into its own, right? So book your flights now, before all the tourists, before McDonald's gets there. But So what you call the overdetermined part of it is really happening at a number of levels, right? The geopolitical level, at the INS level, at the popular imaginary level, right? Yes.
I mean, do you see a very political current issue around this, or is that sort of the effect of this kind of structural racism?
I think the argument in this paper will do the thinking for me, in the sense that I think what's going to happen is we will continue to see a preference for Tibet for the geopolitical reasons historically, but also because until Tibet is resolved, there is no room in the popular consciousness for Mongolia at this point. Yeah, Mongolia is still divided as in inner and outer Mongolia, right? Part of Mongolia is still in northern China. Mongolia is also now heavily overrun by Christian missionaries. And in fact, I learned recently that the first Catholic contemporary missions were Filipino Americans who were sent. Yeah. So these are very complicated narratives, right? The environmental issues of absolutely. Yeah. So, but I don't think, because Mongolia represents this emptiness for us. I mean, we can't comprehend. If you look at a map and you look at how big Kazakhstan is. I mean, on the map it's big, and I can't imagine going there and saying, okay, so Kazakhstan is from here to here. Mongolia is similarly quite large, and you have these vast expanses of the Gobi Desert, right, and the Altai Plain. I mean, it's just beyond our ability to think about it, and to sort of think about culture in that sphere works against it, right? So plus also the lingering images in the popular imaginary about who Mongols are, right? Yes.
I wonder if you could comment a bit more on, to pick up on David's question about the kind of structural forms of racism, etc., in the elation of Mongolian identity, and what we might call the personally idiosyncratic. As you were speaking about the living Buddha, it's kind of an iconic photograph that gets into a lot of Buddhism books, at least, for Central Asia. There's a lot, one wonders, what if he'd been able to speak English? What if it had the same sort of charismatic appeal of the Dalai Lama, who himself is deeply controversial among Tibetans for aligning this 5 non-Baluch main identities in Tibetan Buddhism and in Tibetan communities? How much is structural in the story of the living Buddha in Mongolism? How much is personally idiosyncratic?
Well, I mean, by all accounts, the living Buddha was extremely charismatic. And he actually moved in very high circles. Antoinette Gordon, who for many years was the curator of Tibetan arts at the Guggenheim, she actually learned her Tibetan from the living Buddha. So Antoinette Gordon, who's the wife of Milton Gordon, the sociologist. So actually, he was kind of a celeb in the 50s, and then for some reason gets forgotten, right? And what's interesting is that he in 1965, he dies of cancer in 1965, and the New York Times publishes these accounts of him dying in this Upper East Side or Lower East Side tenement apartment. Right? So this lonely old 82-year-old man dying of cancer by himself, right? And so you think about his death and the death of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and his funeral procession with all the hoo-ha, right? So there are ways in which the imaginary has structured the way that these things are promoted. So despite his lack of English, I mean, there were still ways in which he, with the help of Lattimore, right, was able to actually function. I mean, he, in fact, during the 1950s, anybody who wanted to study Mongolian politics, history, religion, had to interview the Diluv, who had a photographic memory of the Narrowbanchen monastery. And in fact, any scholar that you pick up writing in the 50s on Mongolia, you will find inevitably the footnote, interview with the Diluv Khatakt, right? So in fact, he was public, he was scholar, he worked at Johns Hopkins in that Mongol project. It was that he wasn't interested in perpetuating that, because for him being Mongol, being a Mongol Buddhist, was in fact, my argument is, primary to him, rather than spreading some notion of what Buddhism was, right? So structurally, I guess that might be account for a structural thing. I don't know if I'm answering your question really, but despite the fact that I've drawn a picture of him in the text as sort of a community guy, no, he was very well traveled. In fact, Boston, the Mongolist who was at Harvard and who was at Berkeley, tells me that at one point there was even when you march in the army, da 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 da. There was actually a Diluv Khatakt one that was made up. I have heard that it's been said da 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 da. Diluv Khatakt is mighty something. I don't know. It was something. There was a thing that he said. So so all these little stories about him. It's like well, why didn't I know about him? As somebody who works in Asian American religion, as someone who's interested in Buddhism in the United States, it's like, well, that's the structure. The structure is the literature in Buddhism in America where errors are replicated, where people just absorb bibliography and say, oh, that's the narrative, right? And you say, wait a minute, there's something else here, right? I was just I was suspicious about that, right? So as part of those kinds of discourses or that form racial projects, right? It's those discourses, institutions, traditions that create these racial projects.
To press toward the theorizing
Okay, good.
Of the talk in relationship to this series, one way of reading your lecture, and I would expect that you would resist it, but I'm interested in knowing why you might resist this interpretation, is that race and religion in this account might be considered epiphenomena of geopolitical forces, both in the first narrative certain political forces use race as a factor of exclusion with regard to immigration policy. And with the Buddhist religion example in the second narrative, that geopolitical forces, Cold War politics, and the holdover of the particular status of Tibet are far more important factors than either race or religion when the story is told. So is that an inaccurate way of reading it, or if not, press back on the two categories to say they're more than epiphenomena?
Well, it's another way of reading those narratives, right? In the first case, in the Kalmyk case, there is some recognition in the documents about how the Tartar was okay because he was a Mohammedan and therefore a person of the book. In the Kalmyk case, there was mentioned the fact that they're Buddhists and so they're different, right? And in the context of the 1950s, in Will Herberg's America, where you're Protestant, Catholic, or Jew, what Herberg says in his last chapter of that book that to be a Buddhist or a Hindu is tantamount to not being American, right? So there's a way in which there is this aroma or this homogeneity around Christianity and maybe Judaism, that's going to infuse the way that the administrators are looking at the Kalmyk Mongols, right? The issue of race, I would push back and say if you read the documents, and particularly when you see the charts, it's very clear that there is a scrambling by both sides in the INS board to try and really figure out what is a Mongolian or what is a Mongol, right? And this happens throughout the 20th century. There's some spectacular cases in Los Angeles in the 1930s involving Filipinos and anti-miscegenation intermarriage laws, where Filipinos who are again sort of are they Asian? Are they Malay? What are they? There are wonderful tortured court cases with. LA County versus Roldan, 1930. Filipinos are Malay after they rejected the Mongolian argument. And then, of course, the California legislators amends a law that says, well, white people can't marry Malays, right? So since Filipinos have been reclassified, we still don't want them to marry white women, so we'll create a law, right? So at every instance in this literature, when race appears, there is an equal and opposite reaction by legislators to contain that, right? So, we see this in terms of the history of Asian immigration to this country. So after we prohibit Chinese from entering in the 1880s, then we let Japanese in, a law is passed to prohibit Japanese. We let Filipinos in, Filipinos are prohibited, and so it goes. So I would say that in fact we can't separate the race logic out of these issues of immigration and naturalization, because it speaks directly to the question about what is an American, what is the American character. And in the 19th century, people who weren't of a particular look were not considered to be eligible to be Americans, right? With regard to the second one, that's a little harder one to crack, and mostly because I'm going to cheat here and say mostly because I haven't seen all of the documents yet, right? And trying to reconstruct the living Buddha's life is a little bit harder now because what I'm getting now is somebody in Connecticut whose father cared for the living Buddha in his last days. Well, the father's now dead, so I'm going to interview the son to find out what he knows about. It's twice removed, right? I think the story for the living Buddha is really the one about the way that the academy has in fact been a large part of the disappearance of Mongols because of the way that the academy has signed on to the fetishization of Tibetan Buddhism and has ignored this particular figure. I mean, this guy's like a cardinal in the faith. He's a major figure. It would be as if though we were studying the Catholic tradition and ignored before he became Pope Ratzinger, and say, there's that guy, right? But because he's German, I guess he's not really a Catholic. Because to be Catholic, you have to be Italian or something. I don't know. Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about any intellectual terms of this project in relation to your other work. I was thinking such a detailed presentation, I would think would come from someone who's been spending all their life in Mongolian texts, but this is kind of a refreshing and rare opportunity to hear this from a scholar who's worked in Latino religions and other religious communities. Are there any ways in which this new project made you rethink something about race or religion or ethnicity that you had been holding on to from your work in Latino religion?
Well, it follows a trajectory or pattern, which is to try and find out what's missing, right? So, for example, in my book, King Tiger, I had always heard the narrative of Reyes López Tijerina as, oh, that crazy guy who decided to go to the Tierra Amarilla courthouse and to arrest the district attorney for crimes against the people. So he goes there with his guys and shoots up the courthouse, takes some people hostage. The police come. He goes into the mountains. The grandson of General Pershing actually sends the tanks out to find him, as Davíd was saying. And so I thought, that's interesting. But, I read someplace way back where that he actually started off as a Pentecostal evangelist. What's that about? So when I started researching Reyes' life, I found out that, in fact, he had gone to the Bible Institute in Texas. He had a life full of dreams. He builds a the only known Mexican-American utopian community in Arizona in the 1950s based upon religious principles. So by scratching and by looking for, in this case, religion, Pentecostalism, I was able to uncover a whole history of forms of Mexican borderlands Pentecostalism that had been ignored, right? So that was one thing. The other thing was that Reyes was also very interested in race as well, and so he believed in that he adopted the lost tribes idea, and so that Latinos become the lost tribes because he can trace from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures, and the Encyclopedia of Judaism, which he has highlighted, memorized large parts of. He can trace the tribes from there into Iberia and then into Latin America, right? So Spanish-speaking peoples are in fact, we're the lost tribes, and so then he has this idea that we are. So then, borrowing from Mexican ideas of race identity, he then says, well, Latinos are in fact the cosmic race, borrowed from Vasconcelos, right? So there's a way in which, for me, trying to think about juggling both religion and race together is a way of seeing things that should be there already in the literature, but then when you begin to put a spotlight on them together, you see things, as I said in my paper, gaps are revealed, and Grand Canyons are revealed, right? And the thing about it is it's not rocket science, right? It's the way that traditional disciplines. And this is why they're called disciplines, right? They structure you to see things in particular ways, right? So you have to do as what Charles Long calls is to think crazy, right? To read widely, to see lots of things, so that you can find things that have been heretofore undiscovered. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. A reminder that the Religion and Society and Theology Colloquia are meeting again at 9 o'clock in the Braun Room. Breakfast will be served for an opportunity for continued conversation in a workshop setting at that time. So 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And again, many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.